All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. We'll be talking about the state of data, privacy and digital marketing, why changes were necessary, how we got here, and what we can expect in the future. Today, alongside with me are Michael Siderzeski, the VP of Innovation and Technology. Michael joins us having worked over 30 years in the digital space, both creating platforms and technology for many of the world's most loved brands. With Tandem, he also leads our data governance practice, ensuring we stay up to date on the latest laws, best practices, and new ways for us to be working with our existing clients. Also with me today is Tracy Camlin. Tracy is a data storyteller fluent in the measurement and optimization of omni-channel presences. From apps to websites and media, she has led agency and brand side digital marketing, measurement, and reporting teams and strategies to discover new insights and unlock growth opportunities. Paramount to today's discussion is understanding your data, what you have, and how you can use it moving forward. Thank you both for joining me today. Just some general housekeeping before we begin. If you have any questions or comments, you can use the chat to go ahead and put those in. We have a separate section for Q&A at the end of our program, but if you have any questions as we go through our discussion today, go ahead and put them in there and I'll keep track of those to use at the end. So let's start talking about it. What to expect in today's webinar. We're going to talk about the history and where we are with data governance and all the legalities around it. But really, it's about 5 actionable takeaways that will help your business prepare for this new marketing future. Really understanding, what are the data practices, what's important in what you currently have, and how best to use it and engaging your audience. So we'll be sure to point out those 5 takeaways as well as summarize those at the end for you. Really, let's talk about where we began. When we think about the early days of a lot of data sharing and where we were getting it, a ton of that was coming from social media. And so this quote from Mark Zuckerberg in 2010, people have really gotten comfortable, not only sharing more information in different kinds, but more openly and with more people. And if you think about the heyday of it, we started gathering a ton of data and a ton of information about people and being able to use it in a variety of ways. And what really happened and shifted in the course of 9 years, looking at this quote, is that people started to abuse it. They weren't using it in the right ways. Consumers didn't like some of the targeting and practices that were being done. And so there were various governments that stepped in to protect the data of individual consumers. And so in this quote, Facebook's fined $5 billion by the FTC and must update and adopt new privacy and security measures. So let's talk about that, because it's a current future that's a little bit scary to navigate with all of the different laws and things that we have coming at us. New privacy regulations that have already been enacted through Apple, social media, third-party vendors, et cetera. So digital marketing has really evolved, and the big question is, are you ready for it? And so with this, I'll actually turn it over to Tracy, who's going to begin our discussion for us today.
Thanks, David. So, what do we have to lose here? I think there's a lot on the line. As marketers, we've really become reliant on cookies and third-party data, and it's in an effort to extend our audiences and reach and prospect for new customers, the holy grail, right? But I think, when iOS app tracking updates rolled out, that's sort of when the meteor hit. We saw our targetable audiences immediately plummet. Visibility into campaign performance was absolutely rocked. And so with more Apple updates, as they continue to kind of, roll out more privacy changes, we're even seeing how email is impacted. There's changes to how we're measuring success there. We've tossed open rates out the window, and now we're taking it back to clicks. And I think also, in terms of programmatic media, which is, definitely a tool in our toolkit, depends heavily on cookies. And so this looming cookieless future, I think, has created even more panic in this space. And depending on how you're measuring your conversions and your campaigns, measuring ROI has become even murkier. So definitely a lot of shakeup in the way we campaign now and in the future, and how we measure that success.
So the journey here was kind of an interesting one. If you were around, or you're familiar with the technologies that were around in the 90s, this was really a time where there was a lot of exploration, a lot of companies being created, a lot of entrepreneurs doing things because they could. Also remember that the early times of the internet or the web, these things were all educational institutions and governmental institutions. So there was a lot of discovery going on there. We had things come out of that discovery like link exchange, and that was one of the first ad networks. We had the idea of what was called a web bug, if anybody remembers that. Today we call it a pixel, but it was the idea of adding a single transparent GIF to a web page so that you could track and understand what was going on there. And then in the 2000s, the popularity of that web bug became, kind of omnipresent in all of the applications and sites that were developed. We had a technology that became known as Ajax, but it was really introduced by Microsoft and Internet Explorer. The standardization of JavaScript and CSS and those kinds of things really helped push forward a new age of interactivity in websites. And so for the first time, you were starting to see these great sites like Dig and what have you, where this interaction just kind of flowed. And it was very obvious to the user that something had changed. What they weren't aware of, though, is that those same technologies, Ajax and those kinds of things, were being used to track them even more closely across the web. And that's when third-party cookies really became kind of an issue. And for those of you that don't know, when you see a UTM tag in any of your digital campaigns, that actually comes from when Google bought a company called Urchin Software. That UTM stands for Urchin Tracking Module. There's a little bit of history there for you if you didn't know what that was. But since then, since those times and since 2010, roughly, users really started to take note of how their data was being used. And we saw the quote from Zuckerberg earlier. They were starting to pay attention to how governments were reacting around the world. And so GDPR was introduced in 2016, implemented in 2018. And then CCPA was a huge deal for us here in the United States. And since that time, most every state in the United States has either legislation on the books or has passed some form of legislation. That makes it incredibly difficult for us as marketers to keep up with this complexity. And so one of the responses to that has been that Google introduced the Privacy Sandbox. I think that was 2020 when they did that for Chrome. And then just recently, a few days ago, in fact, right before this webinar, they introduced the Google Privacy Sandbox for Android. And that's an important thing because Android has been kind of a separate deal from Google in the way that it addresses privacy. And they're making some headwinds toward the similar motions that Apple did with app tracking transparency. So that'll be interesting to watch. I don't expect anybody to look at this graph and read it and pay attention to it. Really what it's designed to do is to show you how complex this space is. And we have a new responsibility as marketers and people in the digital space to understand and keep up with all of these changes. And so again, I don't expect you to pay a whole lot of attention to this slide, just an illustration. But what that's done is it's caused us to really rethink how we deploy these solutions and how we deploy our technologies. We have to pay now attention to privacy laws, platform requirements. We have to listen to these different signals from all over the place, where before it felt like we were working with our brands and kind of doing the things that worked. But the important part is that brands now have to pay attention to. It's not just the agencies that have to pay attention, but brands have responsibility.
Yeah. And so in that sort of adaptation, these are the questions we're asking clients when we're onboarding them. And I think you'll see here that there's an underlying theme of data. We want to understand what the current state of your data is. We need to understand where you are now so we can map the path forward. Do you have a plan in place to grow your first party data? Because honestly, that is truly going to be the key to staying nimble throughout this evolving data privacy landscape. It's going to be first party data that lets you future-proof your business.
Yep. Absolutely. So Deloitte Insights magazine published in 2021 the future of the cookieless future. And it was a great story. It's linked below, and we're going to share these slides afterwards so you can go look at it if you haven't seen it. But they make a really great point. The companies that were experiencing high growth were actually taking first party data seriously. They were the first ones to implement these changes and really start caring about the user as an object versus as a tool for profit. So that was a really great story. Go check that out. But look, so I understand a lot of the people on this call are in this space, and sometimes we throw around language like first party cookies, and you may hear it may partially understand what it is, but Tracy, will you take us through the 4 different types of data, just so we kind of have a level set of what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, in the common data types, we have zero-party data. This is data that a user intentionally shares with us. So it can be anything from preference center data to purchase intent. And it's a very fine distinction here between zero-party and first-party data, but the real distinction is that it's intentionally shared upfront. First-party data, I think we're all somewhat familiar with. It's the data that a brand captures about a user and then you own. So this can include website or app behavior, any other kind of transactional detail. All that is first-party data, and that's yours to use and own with consent. Then getting to second-party data, this is less common in play, and I can give you an offline example of this. I think of it as those sort of flyers in, if you order something like I get HelloFresh kits, and there's flyers in there for other products I might be interested in, and that's sharing of data between companies based on what they know about me, saying you might also like this. So that's an offline example, but it's not as frequently in use today. Then finally, we have third-party data. And this is, as we all know, the data collected by organizations that you've never interacted with firsthand. And so this is where we sort of, went haywire with data, right? This is what we've been using to kind of round out our audiences and extend what we know and hopefully help prospect and, gain more insight on our users. And this is the area that is kind of endangered today.
Really helps to enable your microphone. So apologies for that. Let's walk through those 5 action steps. And some of these are going to be a little bit shocking, but they really should be. I mean, if we're really going to take this consumer privacy thing seriously, we need to make some pretty drastic changes into our systems. So the first one is to reboot your CRM program. Now, this sounds pretty big and hairy, but if you have 3 million people in your database already, you're thinking like, why would I reboot my CRM program? But if you think about this from the user's perspective, if you were to send an email to all 3 million of those people saying, hey, we're really starting to pay attention to and focus on privacy. We need your permission for certain things that we want to do on our side. We always want to give you control of your data that's in our platform. And we'd like to give you this option to opt in or out at any time for any type of communication. You really should think about starting with a new database. So you email those 3 million people, you give them the option to opt into this new platform. Then you have this foundation of good data, right? You would never append third-party data to this. You keep it clean and pure. It's all yours to own. And so the second step is to make sure that you're connecting user accounts to that journey, to the user's journey through your website, through the things they're interacting with on your website. This seems like an obvious step, but I've seen a lot of sites that feel like they're just publishing platforms and they'll collect an email address. They don't require the user to log in. It can kind of be a barrier, but it just depends on how you implement that user account setup. So, I mean, again, the idea here is to anchor that user's journey to the CRM, give the user the option to choose what type of communication and what sort of a cadence they want from you. And that's across email, social, and so on. So the next step is utilizing those 2 previous steps to do some sort of very small but very specific surveys. They can be on a website, they can be through email, SMS, whatever you want to do there, but gather 1 or 2 data points at a time and make sure to store that content into the CRM. That way you can enhance your email segmentation, your list building, all of the journeys that you want to build for the future of those particular individuals. And that creates a much more customized experience for those users, and they feel more respected and they feel more cared to, attended to. And then there's no better salesperson in your organization than an incentivized customer. And what you want to do is you want to try to leverage that enthusiasm by giving them some referral credits or points or whatever those kinds of things are. There's nothing brand new about loyalty. What is different here, though, is how we approach loyalty in regard to building that CRM and building that database of content that we actually own, right? That's really important here. And then test and iterate everything. If I haven't made it clear, if I haven't said it before, all of these things are things that you can start, you can learn from, you can iterate and constantly improve and get better, right? So, and then finally, step 5 is to make sure that all the way through the customer journey, from the first interaction with your site to creating that account to every time they come back or engage with you in email or social, that we're utilizing the data that we captured and we've stored in our CRM. A lot of times I see that, you know, people accumulate a giant database and they're sending the same content through email to every single user in that system, when it's super simple to be able to capture and segment that data and really make those users feel honored. And so you may have a list of 3 million people, 2 million of those are active. Let's go back and make sure that we want those people to engage. So this is a funny quote that I put in here from Back to the Future. This is Dr. Emmett Brown. The future isn't written, it can be changed. Anyone can make their future whatever they want it to be. And the reason I put this in here is just to reiterate, those top 5 steps are something that can be pretty drastic if you approach them with fear. But if you approach them with learning and iteration, these are things that can completely change your business and your relationship with your consumers. So in summary, rebuild that CRM program. It doesn't have to start from scratch. Ideally, it starts from scratch so that you know there's absolutely no third-party data in there. Incentivize account creation. Make sure that when a user comes to your site, you're doing your best to capture that user and bring them into your CRM by linking that user's account to the CRM. Engage with your users, ask them questions, make sure that they feel attached in some way to your brand. Only ask them relevant questions. I mean, make sure that everything that you do is on brand and beneficial to the user. Bring loyalty and rewards in if you haven't. This applies to so many different types of organizations that I think a lot of people think, it doesn't really apply to me. But if you have enthusiastic customers, absolutely it applies. And then make sure that you're utilizing those previous 4 steps to build a really engaging and practical journey for your users throughout web, email, and any other touch points that you have with them.
Yeah, I can think of a few companies that do this particularly well too. I'm sure everybody has some ideas, but I know as a pet owner, animal lover, I think PetSmart does a great job. So every experience and interaction I have with them is highly personalized, from the app to the email. They take the data from transacting with me and apply it in novel ways, right? So I get an email that's like, hey, it's your cat's birthday, here's some treats, and it's incentivizing me. Of course, I'm getting discounts and things like that, but it is building loyalty. Here I am talking about PetSmart, right? So I think that's one really great example. And I think also anybody who shopped at Target and used the app for curbside experience will probably rave about that. And that's an example. I think that's interesting too, because they are using your location data in real time in order to enable that, but you agree to it because it makes your life simpler. It's a lot easier to work with. And so I think, for me, those are 2 really great examples of how you can really use this data in a positive way, that people are willing to give that data to you because you're enriching their experience and making the transaction seamless. I'm sure you guys have other examples too.
No, that's great. And just a reminder too, as soon as you start to establish that trust with the brand or with the consumer, they're going to give you more access. They're going to give you more ability to engage with them, right? So super important.
Yeah. And, we talked at the beginning about what we stand to lose, and that's very scary. As marketers, again, we've become dependent on a lot of these third-party data sources, and I've seen some success with it. So I think when you hear, this sort of impending doom about what we're going to lose, it's definitely scary. But there is always an upside, and I do think that we stand to gain quite a lot from some of these changes. It may be a little painful in the interim, but really it's sparking some innovation. And so I think what we stand to gain from this is enhanced brand trust. Just like I spoke about brands that I enjoy transacting with, because they're using data in a responsible way, they give me control over that data, so I can always opt in, opt out. That's really establishing brand trust, which is key, to kind of growing revenue with this kind of program. So I think that's one real positive benefit. Again, you're going to drive more engaged, loyal customers. And as Michael's mentioned throughout this presentation, that's really where it is, right? So you can't get a better referral or a better review than an engaged, loyal customer. And you earn that through, honoring their data privacy and establishing that brand trust. Through that, you're going to have increased return on investment, right? So your marketing dollars are going to go further. You're going to gain efficiencies by using data that you haven't owned. You're not paying for additional third-party add-on. And you're using what you know about people to better cater the experience to them. That's only going to lead to efficiencies. And then finally, I think this one is brilliant, is the growth in customer lifetime value. Over time, I would say PetSmart, Target, those brands are getting more and more out of me, and I'm sort of blinded to other competitors in a sense, because I enjoy transacting with them so much that there's no real point for me to look elsewhere. And that's also finding ways to increase the ticket value, right? So every time I go to Target, they're like, hey, did you want to buy this? You usually do. And same thing for PetSmart. They're always reminding me of things. My dog needs a treat, and my dog is thankful too. So I think I think really, again, in the long run, the things that we stand to gain are far greater than what we feel like we're losing. But the key is really setting up this first party data landscape for your business, and really investing in that.
Got it. Well, we've got quite a few questions that are coming in. I'll remind everyone that if you have any questions for our panel, if you want to go ahead and add them into the chat to the right of your screen, we'll go ahead and get some of those answered. One of the first questions, just for the group up here. So when we talk about zero party and first party, second, third party data, right? So in the grand scheme of things, when we talk about data privacy, is the belief that zero and first party data are going to stay, whereas second and third party data are eventually going to go away and we're not going to be able to use those? Or talk a little bit about what that current to future state's going to look like.
Yeah, I definitely think that the push is going to be to zero and first party data. That's where the real gold is going to be. I don't know that I think second and third party is going to go away. I think some of, like, for example, some programmatic vendors are working, and Google's working to kind of create these aggregated audiences, I think to kind of extend some of that third party. I just think that there's going to be a real lockdown on the applications of that. Michael?
Yeah, I think you're right, Tracy, that there is always going to be an opportunity for that third-party data, but it's going to change. Google introduced and just recently canceled something called Flock. They've moved to something called Topics now. Those are in-browser kind of categories that you can use via API and JavaScript to access data like that. But the third-party cookie is definitely going to go away at some point. As soon as Google flips the switch in Chrome, you can be assured that the other browsers are going to do the same thing. And Apple's already got some of these things disabled by default in iOS and Safari on the Mac as well. So something super important to pay attention to. I would say that the opposite of that question is, if you, as an organization, focus entirely on zero and first-party data, the rest of it simply won't matter anymore, right? If you can train your organization away from second and third-party data, and think about the power of owning first and zero party data, it's incredible. It's incredible. And be sure to reward your users when they give you data.
And another question that comes in is, will the pressure on data privacy stabilize, or will the restrictions on marketers continue to tighten?
I believe this is a nonstop kind of ever evolving question. Until there's a platform that you can safely look at and say, oh, look, they do everything exactly right, there's always going to be pressure for consumers, right? As long as there is a consumer whose data was misused or leaked. We didn't even talk about the growth of exploits and hackers and these compromises at some of our most trusted organizations. We haven't even talked about that. And so as long as that is something that's going on in the market, you can rest assured that there's going to be increasing pressure on how marketers use, gather, and collect data.
Yeah. And I think a big piece that we talked about was some of the things that we lose or that are put at risk, right? And so when we talk about not having these pixels and cookie actions that we regularly do, it makes me think a lot about programmatic advertising, right? And so what happens to programmatic? Like, how is that, does that continue to have value, or how do we continue to go about that type of behavior?
Yeah, I think that's of real interest to me, and I think that's a really interesting space. So, right now, programmatic has relied extensively on cookies and also pixels. So, what they've kind of thrived on is having pixels placed all across the web, and then they're sort of data mining that to build out these audiences and repackage and sell to you. So, I think there's a lot of room for innovation here, and I think we're starting to see it with some vendors are rolling out their versions of these sort of aggregated audiences, and I almost think it's going to perform better. I think it's going to be more related to actual interest, and I'm hoping that it gets refined over time to the point where programmatic is really valuable and it gets more efficient in that it's not advertising things repeatedly to you after you've already made the purchase, after you've already done that transaction. So I think there's room, but I also think this is really positive because it's forcing that innovation. They've gotten a little lazy with pixels and cookies and just selling you this sort of metadata, but I think it's going to really push, and it's probably going to push some programmatic vendors out of the space entirely.
Yeah,
Sure.
and the fun thing about that is that in response to a lot of these tracking technologies, we have new browsers. I'm using Brave right now, which is a shoot off of the Chrome engine that doesn't enable any of this tracking by default. In fact, you can see very clearly in the toolbar how many third-party actions there were on the site that you're on. Super duper useful. But on the other side, Google right now is where most of our programmatic advertising is going, right? We're buying ads on Google, we're buying ads through their platform. But there are competitors, and I think that's genius, right? There's DuckDuckGo, Brave has their own search engine, there's Ecosia, there are all sorts of alternatives. And so if you think about, again, harnessing and leveraging that first party data first, you might explore the opportunities of advertising with those other more smaller focused search engines. Just experiment with it. Like I said, this whole thing is about test and iteration, which isn't something that happens a lot in large organizations typically, but I think it's really important to do in this space. Embrace the other organizations that are on the same path as you, and I think we're all going to be fine.
And a follow-up question on programmatic. So how big of an upper hand will Google Display and Video 360 have on other DSPs like the Trade Desk, who don't actually have first-party data?
Right. That's a really interesting question. I wonder if Google has stalled some of their cookieless push to 2023 in an effort to kind of prepare for that and to get their ducks in a row, so to speak. That's an interesting question, and it's not something I really considered, but I do wonder if that is going to make Google even more of a powerhouse in this space. That's a really good question. Yeah.
The Privacy Sandbox. So if you haven't been there, it's privacysandbox.com. Google is very transparent about their plans and the tests that they're running in the organization. And you can see some of these questions come up in there. There's a lot of great discussion in there. The reason that they introduced the Privacy Sandbox for Android, they're not doing any implementations until 2025, but they want to make sure that they get all of the feedback from the vendors, from consumers, and all of that. They feel like Apple did a great injustice to the marketing world by just introducing app tracking transparency and putting it into the market. Well, what they forget is Apple introduced the idea a year or more before they actually put it in the market. So they went through that same iteration process. But Google doesn't do things overnight to make changes to platforms. It's going to affect not only their bottom line because they're an advertising first company, but those vendors that support them.
Well, and there's an entire, industry, careers, and all that based solely on really what they do, right? So, it doesn't behoove them or anyone, to just kind of pull the rug out from under overnight. But I like that Privacy Sandbox. I thought there was a lot of really interesting information there. I like that you can participate in some of their testing as a developer. So I think there's some really cool opportunities there to help shape where this goes in the future.
Awesome. And a question I know is near and dear to Sidorzeski's heart. What kind of role is Metaverse going to play when it comes to data privacy?
Oh, wow. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there, because right now we're looking at click tracking, we're looking at different interactions in 2D, and really, the most granular you can get is mouse movement, right? We track somebody's mouse cursor across the screen and it pushes AJAX calls back to a server tracking that kind of thing. But if you think about the metaverse and what it's really really designed to be. This is an immersive environment. And so instead of just looking at attention, you can look at swing motion when you're playing a game. Has your motion changed from yesterday to today? When you approach a different type of person in the environment, they can capture all of this data, see how you interact with people. And so this is exactly the way to think about it. Right now, the web is kind of a pancake, right? You're looking at a screen that's just presenting data to you. And the metaverse, as I kind of see it, is a 6 degrees of freedom action. And every one of those 6 degrees plus your site tracking, plus all of the interactions with other avatars, it's going to get pretty crazy. And there's some great organizations who are trying to pay attention to this right now. There's a guy named Kent Bai on Twitter. It's Kent Bai is his handle, and I'm happy to pass that on to you. But he's paying a lot of attention to this space. He interacts with Meta and a bunch of the organizations in there. And if I remember right, it's XRSI is another organization. I don't know if I have that right, but they are specifically looking at how the metaverse and VR and XR interact and impact children. And so one of the most disturbing things that I've seen is Horizon Worlds is Meta's kind of social network in VR. And it is a 13 and over platform, but you can clearly see that there are kids in there that are 6 to 8 to 10 that really just shouldn't be in there. So this is not a problem with just Meta's platforms. Of course, VR chat and Roblox all have the same problem. Point is, it's so early in the metaverse to answer these questions right now. If you think back to the time before the web, just say 1992. And all of the changes that came along with the web and where we are today, I feel like we're about 1993 as far as the metaverse goes. Everything is about to change, and we're in that exploration, we're in that innovation kind of phase in that space.
I think I love hearing you talk about this. I really do, and I think that yeah, because your passion comes through, and I think it's really fascinating because it's a new frontier, right? And I think we kind of take everything that we have learned to date and hopefully apply that here in Meta, right? So that we understand in the metaverse, that we understand, like, we're baking in some of these privacy controls and things right now. So we start out a little further ahead than we did with the web. But I do think that it brings a whole new space for engaging experiences, right? That's where I think it's going to be really neat to see how that data is leveraged, to really make, because you're talking about, measuring a swing, for example. I could see how that could improve your golf game in real life, or what have you. So that's fascinating and of real value. But again, it's just how you kind of consent to that and use it.
Yeah, it's even posture. It's all kinds of data points that we don't have access to on the web.
Yeah, absolutely.
So super important. And I think, the big takeaway from that is that it is early. There is a lot of innovation. There's a lot of opportunity to fix, like you said, things that we know we did wrong with the web that we don't have to do again in the metaverse.
Got it. And then a question from the audience. So the metaverse person that you mentioned, do you know their Twitter handle that you could share?
Yeah, it's Kent, Kent Bye. Kent Bai.
Kent Bai.
Yeah.
Awesome. As we get to the end of this, two questions, I guess, a two-parter. First, how can people stay up to date on all of this, new data, new information that's coming together? And what's the first step that someone should be taking with their brand or in speaking to their agency about making sure, A, that we're compliant, or B, that we have a strategy or roadmap coming forward, right? So give me some background on those two.
Yeah, I think first of all, if you're working with an agency today, make sure that they understand this stuff. Make sure that they're taking it to heart and they're not blowing it off as something that's going to just disappear in the future. And if you don't have an agency that you're working with, we're happy to have a chat and kind of coach you and guide you through these first steps. It's a really difficult process to keep up with. And so if it's not your specialty and it's not something that you keep up with on your own, you need to find subject matter experts. And we're happy to step in there and point you to some great resources.
Awesome. And with that, I will actually thank everyone for joining us today. And I will leave us with a final slide that just has all of our contact information on it. If you do have any questions or any follow-ups that you're curious about in this space, feel free to reach out to us. Again, this is a great conversation to have within your organization or with any of the agencies that you're working with, just to understand where you stand in this current and where you plan to go with it. Nobody is safe from this. Nobody has a plan to go around it. It is kind of a black and white, future that we face. So making sure that you're prepared, making sure that you understand what's coming down and when it's happening, and that you're able to pivot quickly and to understand and really dive in to that gold that you have within your zero and first party data. Again, I'd like to thank Tracy and Michael for taking the time to speak with all of us today, and as well to our audience for joining us today. I hope you found this session as beneficial as we did. And if you have any follow-up questions, please reach out to us. Again, we will share all the materials and this webinar back through email to each of you post this session. And if you have any other follow-up questions, you can always get us at our website, www.tandemtheory.com. Thank you all for joining us today.